So welcome back to the channel today, and in today's tutorial we're going to look at something a little bit different, and we're going to look at using soap dough to make flowers. Now, a lot of the techniques I'm using in this video are based upon making sugar flowers, and what I wanted to see really was whether you could use the same techniques for making sugar flowers to make soap dough flowers. So what I've got here is some soap dough. Some soap dough. And this soap dough is just my normal recipe, which I've allowed to come to or through saponification. But before then letting it cure, I've wrapped this up very well in some plastic wrap, in some saran wrap or some cling film. And then I've popped it into a Ziploc bag in order to stop the moisture from evaporating from it. So you don't need to have a specific dough recipe. You can use your standard recipe for soap dough. Now, what you need to do with it is work it very, very well to make it pliable again. Now, you can use this soap dough without gloves on, but what I find is because I'm a man and I've got very deep set fingerprints that I leave lots of marks that I don't want, so I tend to use gloves. And the easiest way to work with this, and iDream Soap has got some wonderful tutorials in how to deal with soap dough and making soap dough embeds. And she is wonderful. So go and check out some of her videos about soap dough, but roll it out between some bits of plastic bag. I tend to use the kind of slightly thicker ones, and you can reuse this again and again and again and again and again and again and again. So don't feel that you've got to kind of throw these bags away once you've done with them. You can use them for time immemorial until they rot. So what I'm doing here is I'm rolling out the soap dough. Now, it does require a little bit of force to roll soap dough out, which is good because its nature is wanting to stay together. So you do have to work a little bit hard for this one. Now, if you want to get an even roll, take a couple of skewers and then roll across the two skewers. So you're getting an even layer of your soap dough. And that just means that you've got the same thickness all the way through. It's just a really easy way of making sure that you've got the same thickness of soap dough all the way through. You can also do this with playing cards. So you can lay different layers of playing cards on each side. Let's say you put 7 on each side. You'll get a 7-card thickness, which is a polymer clay technique for getting thicknesses. But you can then pile those up or drop them down, and you can get various levels of thickness for your soap dough. So a few little techniques there from both kind of polymer claying and sugar flour work. But the idea for this is you want a consistent thickness of the dough. Now, unlike sugar flowers, where you'll take a ball tool and roll it across a foam mat, soap dough doesn't really want to do that, because I think adding things like corn flour and stuff like that into a recipe, A, makes it difficult for you to then go to an assessment, because you've got to include that if you're in the UK, but also I think it dries the soap out too much. And even when this is dry, it's got a little bit of flex to it. And I think if you dry it out too much and take too much of the moisture out, things become way too brittle. So anyway, what I've got here is a orchid cutter. We're going to make some orchids with this. Now, this part makes the kind of bell of the inside and some tails, and you need one of these to make an orchid. If you don't have these cutters, they are relatively cheap, and you can get them from places like Amazon and any cake supplier. And you would need these cutters to do it. Now, I can show you a technique to make roses with both just circle cutters and no cutters. And if you'd like that, leave a comment down in the comments below, and I'll make a tutorial on how to make soap roses. So anyway, this is the throat of the orchid, and we're going to need one of these. And what I'm going to do is, to give it that kind of petally shape, I'm going to work the edges with my fingers. So take off some of the dirt from my fingers here. I'm just going to wipe it off on a little cloth here, so I've not got quite so much stick on my fingers. And I'm just going to work the edges of this and the middles to kind of curve it into the shapes I want. And I'm thinning the edges out. So to make something thick like this look a little bit more delicate, like the final picture you will have seen at the beginning, you want to work the edges, just the edges, so they look thinner at the edge than they do in the middle. So the structure in the middle is thick, and that makes sure that it's going to hold together. But the edges are thin, and it gives the illusion of this being a far more delicate flower than it structurally seems. So it's a little bit of a trick there. We're working with thick dough, but we're also thinning the edges to give that illusion of it being nice and thin. You can see here, I'm working the middle around my thumbs, and I'm using basically the shape of my fingers to create the pockets and the indents of this shape. And I'm just forming it around my fingers. Your fingers really are some of the best tools you can ever have for doing little models like this. Now, I'm not going to lie, this technique is pretty advanced for people to start with, but I thought it quite interesting to see what you can achieve using soap dough and skills that I've picked up in other places. So as you can see here, I'm literally just working that bowl of each one of these sides. I'm stretching it out and making it look more organic, more flower-like. And then I'm bringing it round into this kind of cradle. It's just cradling. Now, there's lots of other little bits and pieces that you can add to an orchid. There's kind of the entrance to the kind of seed area where the pollen would kind of go into, and there are various other things you can do. I did none of those things on this. I didn't want to kind of get too much in depth, and I wanted a tutorial that wouldn't kind of like take 9 hours. I mean, this one is going to be a long tutorial as it stands. So we're basically creating this shape, and we're just working it with our fingers. And this soap dough is probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 weeks old. So again, you can keep soap dough if you keep it wrapped up and you keep it nice and stable in a good sealed container. You can use your soap dough for quite some time to come. Again, don't forget it's soap. So as soon as you bring it out into the air, it's starting to dry, it's starting to lose its water, and it's going to become less manageable. So here, I'm resting it down on the side, and again, I'm just bringing the edges around my finger. I'm just trying to just gently coax it into the shape. I'm not trying to force it. I'm not trying to make it do what it doesn't want to do. I'm allowing the soap to kind of just move into these positions and basically get cupped around my fingers. You can see I'm actually pinching. I'm not kind of stroking or anything like that. I'm not trying to smear the soap. I'm pinching it to give that edge a really nice thinness to it. And it takes a little bit of time, and we're doing this in real time so you can actually see it. And here you can just see I'm rubbing it ever so slightly, and it molded it too much. So I come in with my other hand and I pinch it back into the shape I want. So for me, I find soap dough very forgiving and very, very good way of making flowers. Now, on orchids like this, the bottom section, this little kind of butterfly bit, is separated. So what we do is we just take a knife, we cut that down the middle, and that gives us our kind of 2 sections that you'll see the orchid has. And again, what we do is we separate those ones out, we thin them down with our fingers, make sure it's all nice and kind of thin on the edge, thick in the middle to support it, and you get this beautiful middle to an orchid. Now, I'm not saying this isn't going to take you time. I'm not saying this is something that you're going to pick up in seconds. This takes practice. What's really interesting about soap dough is it's far more forgiving than sugar paste ever was. So I love working with this. And if you make a mistake, you scrunch it back up again and start again. What you'll see I've got on the table here is a piece of foam. Now, this is integral to when you make flowers in sugar, but it's got little divots and peaks in it. And what it allows me to do is pop this form into one of the little divots and then be able to kind of form everything around it. It's nice and soft, and also because it's a foam, it's going to pull some of that moisture out. What it allows me to do is just get that to start forming and keeping its shape. There we go. Unfortunately, it's out of focus, but hey, there we go. We've got a new setup coming, so you should be able to see these a lot better. And that's the first part. That's one of those we need. And then that was a little bit thick for me, so what I'm going to do is just go into here and roll this out a little bit more. So again, I've kept it between the bits of plastic. And what that then allows me to do is go in and re-thin it if I need thinner pieces. So we have 2 other cutters here. There's this one. Now you need 2. So you need 1 of this one, as I'm showing you, and 2 of that one. So this one is basically going to make the 3 petals that sit in the back of the orchid. So this one is a 3 petal. Now, some cutters will have a shape like this, and some cutters will actually give you just a single petal that you need to cut out 3 times. So depending on the set you have, it might be one that looks like that Mercedes sign, or it actually may look like it's just a single leaf, and if it's a single leaf you need to cut 3 of those out. But essentially you want to make these kinds of shapes. So what I'm going to do here is just see how many more I can get out of my little bit of soap dough. Looking for the best place to pop these in. I can get 1 more in there, and then hopefully I can get at least I can get that one out of there, and I don't think I've got any more space, so I may need to re-roll for another. But as you can see, in that little area, I've got virtually 2 whole flowers out of it. And that was, I don't know, maybe it was like 50 grams, 40 grams. It was very, very small amount of soap dough to make quite a few flowers. So now we've got all of our little bits cut out, and again I'm just wiping off on my hands there, and we're going to bring this in. Now this is a sugar flower impression mat, and what it does is it just impresses a slight texture into these petals. Now this is really nice because it takes your orchids from looking flat and dull to having some texture and some movement and some reality to them. So it's really quite nice to be able to get this texture into them. They are pretty cheap. When I bought this one, it was probably about £5 or £6, and I think they're now probably £2 or £3. There's loads of places for them. Amazon will probably do them. Any good cake supplier will do them. And probably places like AliExpress and stuff like that. If you're on those ones, you can probably pick it up there. And all you do is you pop it in between, and you then just apply a little bit of pressure. I'm not pressing too hard, but I'm giving enough pressure to imprint that. And what you'll see is it also flattens it out and gives you that kind of openness to those bits there. Now, if that will focus, I don't know if it will. Let's try. Come on, where are we? There we go. No, we're not going to do it, I don't think. But anyway, there's a texture in there. Promise you, there is a texture in there. And if you zoom into the picture there, you will see that kind of orchid texture. Again, this takes your soap flowers from being flat and not particularly realistic to being far more realistic and far more believable as a flower. So again here, I'm shaping this by using my fingers. Again, fingers are one of the best tools you can have for modelling and stuff like that, particularly if you're doing organic shapes like this. If you want squares and triangles, then you'll want to extrude those and get nice sharp edges to them. With this, you need organic. You want it to look real. You want it to have that realistic look to it. And again, I'm just shaping it, and that will go back onto that little pad of foam to keep the shape to it. These ones, again, really easy. I'm just using my fingers to pinch the edges, to thin the edges down a little bit, to give it more of an organic feel and organic look. And you do have to be a little bit careful with these ones. If you look up in the top left of that green bit I'm working on, you'll see that the little kind of tail that those petals have on them is offset. And you need to make sure you have opposites. So you want one with the tail, let's say it's that way around, it's at the bottom right hand side. The one that is just under my right hand there is the same orientation. And what I'll need to do, the one I'm working on, is a different orientation. See how those tails, it's not that way, it's not that way, it's this way. So you want to have them opposite. They need to reflect, they need to be mirror opposites of one another to make this look real. So again, thinning the edges out, just making it look a little bit more organic, a little bit kind of rough and ready is always good when it comes to flowers. We'll get rid of the hairs in it. It's always one of the things when you're working like this, wipe everything down, but notoriously you're going to get kind of stuff like that in there if you're working for an age. And we're just going to kind of cup that, thin it down. Now I'm not pressing too hard here because I've obviously impressed it and I want to keep the impression, so I don't want to rub that out. Now I've got a rolling pin that you can lay them on, but again, I've got my little bit of foam. That rolling pin is there just for me to be able to lay things on and to give them some shape. So again, we're just going to go through it again. We flatten these out with the impression mat, which does half the work for you. And then you just thin the edges down. This is a really nice way of making soap flowers. So the next step of kind of making your soap dough flowers or your orchids look like flowers is something that we call in sugar craft dusting. Now, I've kind of assumed we're using micas and things like that. We're going to need to use them on our flowers here. And this is really my kind of first learning in this one, and I'm sharing it with you guys, is that the micas tend to be a little bit more shiny when they are not in the soap. And they make it look quite metallic. So I'm going to try this again at another point, and I'm going to use Sugarcraft powders rather than the micas to see whether that gives me a different feel and a different look on these flowers. Now, they're edible, so they're perfectly safe for using on your body, but I think you'll get a better colour and stuff out of them. But what I'm doing here is experimenting with a little bit of pink neon mica combined with some titanium dioxide, and I'm mixing that through. I don't feel it worked particularly well, and I kind of erred towards eventually using natural colorants like oxides and that sort of thing, rather than going to the micas. So you'll see the two flowers that I used in the thumbnail and at the beginning of the video. One is quite metallic and one is kind of quite dark. And the metallic one is using micas and the dark one is using natural oxides and pigments like that. So one of the important things to remember here is that I've left these soap dough petals to dry up a little bit. They're not fully dried, and I could have probably left them out a little bit longer than I did. So working with micas and working with sugar flower pigments is different. I think there is a different intensity of the colour and things like that. So I think if you are going to do these as part of an assessment in the UK, you probably want to look at using natural colorants, but it would be interesting to see what the makeup of colorants for sugar flowers is and see whether there is a way of creating these and making them look even more realistic than we've got them looking here. So brushing these on, working from the center, keeping the beauty of that kind of really nice white batter working really well. So it's one of those things is that this is a bit of trial and error, and you are along on the journey with me doing something different. Now, as with anything kind of handmade and things like that, these really are a little bit of a labour of love, and the whole point of the colours that you're using and what you're going to do here is you're basically going to build the colours up. If you look at natural flowers, you'll notice that they actually have lots of kind of variations of colours through them, and what may initially look like a kind of real purple colour, as you look at the edges, it will move into pinks, or if you look at kind of a pink colour, when it moves to the centre, there's oranges in there. So don't be afraid of really looking at the colours and really looking at how they interact with each other and how they work. So what I'm going to do here is use some interference mica to get my kind of like more of a kind of fantasy flower on the edges, but here I'm looking at using this orange, and you can see now how that colour is really making the centre of the flower darker and pop more, and then we'll move that colour towards the outside and make it look more gentle, more soft, and you can build the colour up. So never be afraid of adding colour upon colour upon colour when you're dusting flowers like this, because you can just build up some really nice shades and start off light and build the colours up so you can really make it look more realistic. So it's entirely up to you how you want to go with it, make them fantasy or make them real. It doesn't really matter. The technique is the same for making the flowers. And if you wanted fantasy flowers, you can add more petals. You can add two of these Mercedes sign ones to the back, and you can have four of the outside ones and two of them. You can really kind of create this however you want. But if you're going for a bit of a natural look like I've got here, you can kind of just look and see how we kind of pull that all together as an overall style and build the colours up one upon one upon one, using different variations of a colour or using completely wild spectrum colours. It's entirely up to you. You can play with this and make it entirely what you want to make it. So this is already going to be quite a long, in-depth tutorial as to what we're doing here, and I don't want it to kind of just be completely daft in the amount of time we spend on it. But what we're going to do is just finish off this one, then we'll move on to just using a little bit of that interference pink mica that I've got here, which is an iridescent pigment. It's got a little bit of pink in it, but for the most part it is kind of shimmery, and that's where you kind of get that metallic-y look from. But again, you don't have to make them look real. You can make them look however you want them. It's your flower, and the really nice thing is it's all soap, so you can use these like a bar of soap. Okay, you're going to crush them and stuff like that, but they make an impact and they make a statement. So we're going to finish off these back petals here, and all I'm doing is adding a wee bit of green to the tips. Whether it works or not sure. In some pictures it's coming out blue, but hey, we're experimenting and we're trying something and we're giving it a go. So we're just going to finish this one off here, and then we'll move on to the two larger kind of petals that we've cupped around our fingers, and we're just going to add a little bit of interference to those ones, a little bit of colour onto the middle one, and then we'll start putting this together. So when this flower goes together, you'll see they normally have one petal at the top and two at the bottom. So the petal on the back needs to have the single petal pointing upwards, and the two, you'll notice they're probably slightly smaller, but the two that make a Y shape are at the bottom. So it's not a regular Y, it's an upside down Y for that initial one. And then the two side petals, the way you want to have them is with the little sticky out bit that looks like a handle on it. You're going to have that uppermost on the side facing those two flowers. So you'll see the way that I've got them laid out here with their little handles pointing to each other, and they are higher rather than being lower. You want them around that way to give them a little bit of height when they sit into the flower, and they are going to sit where we have our Y-shaped back flowers. They are going to sit in the gaps next to the single flower pointing up. So what I'll do is pop that one in the right place there, and that's where essentially they're going to sit. So you have the three behind, then you have the two in front, and you have your single kind of middle bit is the one. So 3, 2, 1. It all works quite nicely. When we talk about odds and evens, this is kind of how it's working. So flowers always tend to have an odd number of petals. If you ever have an even number of petals, it's going to look a little bit odd than having an odd number of petals, if that makes sense. So make sure you've always got an odd number of petals, and the middle bit of an orchid is not technically the petal, it is actually the kind of stamen bit in the middle. It contains all the bits to create seeds, so it's not part of the petals. However, it does have the same form and feeling of a normal, in inverted commas, normal petal, but it's not. So what we're doing is we're just colouring the inside of this. I probably should have done this in a nice pink colour, but I thought, you know what, experimentation, let's put a bit of green in there. You want it darker right in the throat, and then what you'll do is kind of work outwards from there. But I'm just trying to make sure that we're getting some colour into this one so you can see how this is all going to fit together, really. Here we are with the kind of pour of the soap, and you really are sitting with me as I'm kind of experimenting with different things here. So you see I've got a little scoop on the side here, and I've got colorants in the top there. I'm experimenting with a pour technique that I thought about and decided whether or not it was going to work or how I'm going to make it work, which is using the scoop. And then I've got some colorants selected at the top there, which are new colorants to me, and I've never worked with them before. And I'm using this as an experiment to try out some new micas. So we're going to see how these micas hold up in cold process soap. We're going to see what colours they produce, and we're going to come up with ways of working with it. So this is really an experimental pour, but I thought it'd be quite nice to see this pour happen, and then how we take that pour once it's been done and whether we're happy or not with it, how we can turn that into a rather fabulous looking bar of soap by using our soap orchid. So this batter here is just my standard kind of practice batter. So it's got relatively cheap ingredients in it because I'm making rather a lot of soap. So I'm not looking at using very expensive ingredients in this one. I've got a new fragrance oil that I'm using, and we're going to see whether it accelerates or not and stuff like that. So this is really just some lard, some sustainably sourced palm oil, coconut, olive oil, and a little bit of castor oil. I think there's also a little bit of rapeseed oil in there as well. And so I know what you're saying, palm oil and this, that, and the other. It's a very good oil for soap, and you have to weigh up the benefits, the pros and cons, and it is a relatively cheaper oil than using lots of butters and lots of things like that. So I do use it for developing designs and doing tutorial bits and pieces. However, if I'm going to sell the soap and I'm looking at people to buy it, I move away from the palm oil and I move away from things like that. So again, we make our choices as to what we're going to do, and I'm using relatively cheaper oils in this. To boost a bubble, you can put some sugar in there, you can add some silk, you can do all of those things with it. And I quite like this recipe because it can be slow moving. And what it does is has a consistency for me that says if I'm using a new fragrance oil, what is it going to do? If I'm using a new mica, how's it going to come out? Because the fundamental colour of this soap at the end of the day is a white or whiter soap than if I'm using lots of kind of butters and I've got different oils in there. So I like this as my base soap for doing all these experiments. So what I'm doing here is just pouring off some of the batter, and we're going to use this to make our design on top. And then what I'm going to do is anything left, I'm going to add my new fragrance oil into, stir it through, and then pour it into the mold. And that will give me an idea of how that fragrance oil is going to behave in my soap. It also means I've got a nicely fragranced bar, but the top layer, if it does set up quickly on me, is going to be unfragranced, but I can still work and I can still get a design out of it. So again, this is how I'm experimenting. This is how I'm creating new looks, new things, and trying to come up with some new ways of giving you swirls and new soaps that are going to be really kind of creative in their end product. So again, sit with me if you're enjoying this, and if not, you can fast forward to where we actually get to finishing this soap up. I've added the fragrance oil to my base layer here, and I'm pouring it into my mould as a kind of bottom layer, and this is going to give me a good idea as to how this fragrance oil is going to react with my soap. And as you can see from here, it looks like it's actually accelerating the trace, which is fine if I want to do a scraped layer. This is not going to give me the kind of swirl that I wanted, so you can see how much that's set up. So this is probably going to be a really interesting pour. Now, my thought process behind doing this kind of, let's call it a scoop pour, was to pour the colorants into the scoop and then use that to do kind of a scoop pour with, and I wasn't quite sure how it's going to react. So I'm pouring each of these colors in down the side to create kind of like a swirled soap. Now, my mistake here was having not worked with these colors before. I thought, right, we'll go with the reds and we'll just see how they all react. And all the colors I picked here are a little bit too close at this stage. But when you see the final bar, you'll notice that the reds really kind of move back into a pink kind of colour. And I do have one colour here, which is very indistinguishable from the others, but it's called orange yellow. And you'll notice in the final bar, that orange yellow really kind of comes through in that swirl. So all I'm going to do is pour these in one by one, and we'll speed this a little bit up here until we get to the actual pour itself. And you can then see how this kind of idea of mine comes to fruition. So that was a kind of scoop pour there. And as I'm looking at it, I'm thinking, well, do you know what? That's very similar to in the pot swirl or swirls that are already available. Why am I using a swirling shovel when I can just use a jug? So I've got some other ideas for using it, but I thought it was quite nice to see whether that created a swirl that we enjoyed or liked. And what really kind of struck me with it is when you then combine that with the orchid, you get these kind of tendrily bits that orchids tend to have and the leaf shape in some of it. So I was actually quite pleasantly surprised that I got some really interesting and unusual shapes out of it. So we move on to the cut now, and this is also saponified, and we'll flip it over in a minute so you can see the colour difference, but I've left that to you. Now, if you look at this soap in the top here, you'll see where I didn't quite catch some of the batter with the fragrance oil, and you can see the discoloration of the fragrance oil to my normal batter. So my normal batter is pretty white and it's a creamy colour along that top edge, and it's really interesting to see that. So what I'm doing here is I'm marking this out into some bars. It's going to be, I think it's 6 bars we get out of this one, and they're quite chunky ones. So we're not afraid of chunk here. And the knife I'm using here is actually a knife for cutting in half cake. It's a cake slicing knife, but it's massive and it's actually really useful for cutting slabs. So if you are in the market for a decent knife to cut soap with that is not just a standard kitchen butcher's knife, this is brilliant, and it'll do large slabs of soap if you need it. So worth looking at that one there. So we're going to cut this straight down the middle, and then we're going to cut it into bars, and we'll come back when we start to add the final decoration to it. And now we're moving on to the final little bit of creating these soaps. Now, I kind of quite like this shape, and we've got this really nice kind of interesting swirl pattern in it. And I thought, actually, yeah, we can use this for our soaps. So what I've got in my little pot to the left-hand side here is just, again, my standard recipe. Now, I have stick blended this with a frappe mixer until I've got a thick trace. Now, I over mixed this. So initially I get some beautiful trails of soap just dripping down the front, but it started to thicken too quickly. We all make mistakes, and I overblended it. And it's one of those things, is that if you want your batter to be workable at a certain trace, you are better off bringing it to an emulsion or a light trace and then allowing that soap to thicken in its own time, and it will be far more manageable for a longer time and far more predictable than trying to force it into a trace, and it will continue to speed up. And this is a prime example of that happening. So it's worthwhile just watching this little bit here and seeing these first drips are beautiful, and then all of a sudden it just starts to thicken up and I'm having to fight with the soap rather than working with the soap. So again, if ever you want to work with a batter that you need it to do something specific with, like here I wanted it to drip like it was a thin custard or a cream, as we move through it, you'll see that it just starts to thicken and get too unmanageable. So all I've got here is I've got a little pipette, and on the pipette I've actually just taken the very thin end off. So I've opened the end up a little bit, and it gives me a little bit more ability to suck more into it and to deliver more of a thicker drizzle, however you wish to call it. when it comes to doing these drips. So you put the major drips in first and then you just fill in the gaps. So in the top there, you can see how beautifully those drips just look like they're falling down the front of the cake, the front of the soap. But as we move on, you'll see that it just starts to look less like beautiful glaze and more like somebody's trying to spoon on plaster. So again, work with your trace that's going to give you the best and longest time is to allow it to come to a natural trace, slower. It takes patience, and as soapers, we're not always that patient. And the more you can allow it to do that, the better and the longer working time you'll have, and the longer you'll be able to kind of utilize that trace to do what you want to do. And that's really important in soap, because while we're doing all of these things, it is thickening every second. And the faster you bring it to trace, the faster it will get thicker. The slower you bring it to trace, the slower it will get thicker. And you may need to wait, but it'll give you a longer window to work with it. So we sped that little bit up there for you, just so you weren't having to wait and wade through. And as you can see here, my first two batters are beautiful. And then as we move through, they start to become a little bit less fluid and a little more fighty. But hey, we're experimenting in this and we're allowed to make our mistakes. So the final bit of this is really just then adding our orchids onto the front of these. Now, I'd got 2 orchids made up, and I thought, actually, do you know what? We're going to do this little sweet, some with, some without. So I added a little soap to the front of that one to glue it into place. I trust the soap a little bit more than I would with distilled water, and it's going to just mean that it's going to stay where I put it. The first 2 had bonded really nicely, but this middle bit needed a little bit of help. So again, another little bit of soap on there, and we're just going to leave that flat in order to basically saponify and glue everything together. Let's get rid of that little bit on the front there. So that's one we did, and that's using the micas and the iridescent bits. On this second one, we're going to do exactly the same, and on this side, we're going to pop our natural colorants, oxides, and things like that. And this one had stuck together beautifully, so I didn't need any additional support on that one. And you can see how nice and firm they are. They have firmed up beautifully, and they're keeping their shape. And then the third little one here, and if you're interested in seeing how I make these ones, this is a calla lily. That's going to come onto here, and this is a far easier soap to make, and I've got a tutorial that's probably coming up in the next kind of week or so on how to make a beautiful blend from one colour into another using soap dough, and I'll bring that one up for you guys to see a little bit later on next week. So I'll leave you to see just the finishing of these ones, and we'll bring them together, and then we'll have a little bit of a close-up in a moment or two. And so there we have the orchid soap with our orchids just sitting on the front of the soap. They're nice and 3D, nice relief. They're absolutely stunning. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. It really helps me grow and it allows me to make more videos and tutorials for all of you. When you subscribe, don't forget to click the bell icon to get notified when a new video is uploaded. And thanks a lot, Soapsters. I'll see you again next time.